Good to see you, though, man. What's up?
Good to be here and talk Hunter Thompson.
My pleasure. So your book, Freak Kingdom.
You know, we live in interesting times right now. It's kind of a shit show at every single moment.
About a fist from your face. Pull that sucker. There you go.
What should I do with my hands? Should I put them up?
You can do whatever you want with your hands,
but I shoot with this one.
What is all this? You got a lot of writing.
Well, when I wrote the book, I wanted to make sure my sentences never sounded like Thompson's sentences.
Right.
So I didn't write out a lot of his sentences, but this morning before coming on, I went and got some of my favorite quotes and just wrote them out longhand to get a sense of what his perspective was and rhythm was again.
Didn't he do that with The Great Gatsby?
He did it like a few times.
Yeah.
He did it by hand. He like typed it out.
Yeah. I love that idea that he was trying to find like the rhythm of the words. That's such a fascinating notion because comedians do that in the early days of comedy. Like a lot of guys, in like before they ever start going on stage themselves, they'll imitate their favorite comedian's bits. Like they'll do a Richard Pryor bit. And they'll do it to their friends, and they'll get a sense of the rhythm and the timing, and get those laughs from doing a Richard Pryor bit to their friends, and then they get that bug. It's like part of what infects them.
I mean, that's the hardest thing to steal. We're not plagiarizing, but we're trying to understand what decisions they made to make beautiful work.
Yeah, I'm sure he wasn't plagiarizing, but it's so unfortunate when someone does.
Yes.
You know, when you have someone, whether it's Hunter or Richard Pryor or anyone who's just got a truly exceptional and unique mind.
Or someone who doesn't, like our president, and decided when he ran in 2016 to plagiarize Richard Nixon's 1968 convention speech in Miami.
Did he do that?
Directly.
Really?
Yeah, that was the headline in the fucking Times. It said, Nixon's inspiration. I'm sorry, Trump's inspiration, Nixon is the one. So the lines about crime and like barbarians at the gates, crime, law and order, those were all from Nixon's shitty but successful 1968 Miami convention speech. And Thompson knew how effective that was.
Yeah, I wonder if he did that on purpose because he was so good. And one thing that Trump is so good at, he's so good at getting the media to talk about him.
Exactly.
And like one of the best ways to get the media to talk about him was give them something to be angry about that no one else is going to give a fuck about.
He was like, oh, Melania plagiarized, but I plagiarized much better from Nixon.
That's right.
Thompson would have loved it.
Melania took some lines from Michelle Obama's speech, right? Yeah.
Well, if you plagiarize Nixon, that's okay. I mean, so Freak Kingdom, the book about Hunter S. Thompson, I mean, it's really about taking the fucking emotion of living in this present, looking back at Thompson's career, and then trying to write it like a novel to dramatize all of the experiences he went through that are today so applicable to us, and just show his perspective that's so applicable to us today.
What do you got here, Jamie?
From New York Times.
It's Donald Trump's convention, but the inspiration, Nixon.
I was like, you're running on Nixon? That's what you're running on?
There are some parallels, you know. I mean, do you remember when Hunter got together with Bill Murray and Bill's brother, and they did that thing where they were trying to get people to Nixon got a bad deal, we got to bring him back, and people were going along with it.
Oh yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
I do remember. Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah,
like that. There's a lot of parallels with Trump in that regard.
I mean, one of my favorite quotes by Thompson is like, Richard Nixon is, with his Barbie doll family and his Barbie doll wife, is like America's answer to, it's America's Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde. Like, he is the werewolf. He speaks to the werewolf in us. Yeah. And Nixon chose to hide that werewolf his whole career until it finally came out because he was insane with power. Trump ran on the werewolf. He's like, no, I'm not going to hide it. That's who I am. That's what I'm going to use to try to get elected. And like George Wallace did, like other politicians did, it had resonance. And it happened with Trump because of our media environment, because of the place we live in now, to amplify him all the way to the most powerful position in the world, which is insane.
It would be really fascinating to see if Hunter was alive and in his prime now, how he would. I think his take on it would be very similar to Matt Taibbi's. Like Matt Taibbi is, in my opinion, our more reasonable, more put together version of Hunter Thompson because he's more
sustained,
disciplined,
more long career version of Hunter Thompson.
Well, he's like rational and he's there all the time. Like I'm sure you've heard the recently uncovered recording of Hunter calling in to some company that installed a DVD player and he's fucking screaming and yelling. It's like 15 minutes long.
And then he like gets lost and he goes, "What the fuck? And the DVD player doesn't work.
My fucking cords.
I mean, that was the 1980s
Yeah.
were not the best. I think what Taibbi does is what Thompson did very well. Hunter Thompson was really good at looking at Nixon and saying, how are you manipulating the way we see you to get a version of you out? And Taibbi looks at the way the media gets played. He looks at the way that an administration manipulates the media. And he dramatizes that while everybody else just gives us the information the administration's giving us. And that goes back to Thompson with Nixon. Thompson had space when he worked for Rolling Stone. And he could write about how Nixon made everybody watch his speeches, the press, on a closed circuit television. And they made the press, just like Trump, off in the corner when the plane arrived, being berated by everybody. It's very similar to what is going on now. And again, we see people giving hot takes or we see people doing op-eds. We don't see people dramatizing how manipulative these corrupt administrations are and were. And Thompson did that beautifully. Taibbi does that beautifully.
Was Nixon being berated by the press? Is that why he chose to
Well,
have
he thought he was. I mean, he was a crook, so he doesn't want the
Right.
press to investigate him. Like, he was a crook with San Clemente, like his loans with Bibi Rebozo and all of that. He was a crook the way he used the IRS to investigate his enemies. He was a crook when he tried to break into the Brookings Institution to destroy and bomb evidence. Like, he didn't want the press around him because he had committed very serious crimes. And I think that's similar to what we see now. I mean, as people have said on the show, no president wants a journalist, digging into their lives specifically because you don't want chumminess with journalists. But I think Trump and Nixon both knew they had so much to hide that to actually have a journalist like Hunter Thompson, who was a good investigative journalist, to have a journalist like Matt Taibbi around, that's dangerous for them. They'll go to jail, which Nixon should have, and Trump perhaps should.
Well, who knows what's going to happen? How'd you get involved with writing this book?
Well, I mean, I've always loved Hunter S. Thompson, and I was
How'd you
reading,
get exposed to him?
I was 17 years old in a Catholic high school at Bellarmine College Preparatory up in San Jose, and we had a counterculture writing class. And so I read some of it in there, and then a friend had an audiobook of Fear and Loathing. And so I just remember the first time hearing that old audiobook of Fear and Loathing, and we're somewhere around Barstow on the edge of the desert. And then in my 20s, I really got into Strange Rumblings in Aztlan, which is about a conspiracy within the Los Angeles Police Department regarding the death of Ruben Salazar, a prominent journalist. And I read that, and I'm like, oh my God, dude. This isn't somebody that's just dancing on stage or like performing a road narrative. This is an investigative journalist who's going to the most powerful people, exposing things they don't want us to see, and in a sense risking his life to do so, because he says in Strange Rumblings in Aztlan, which is in Rolling Stone in 1970, he says, if they're willing to kill Ruben Salazar, who was the most prominent journalist in Los Angeles, you could argue at the time, what the fuck is to stop them from killing me, Hunter Thompson, for asking these questions?
Well, I think that's what a lot of people are saying today with Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal Khashoggi's death has got a lot of journalists really freaking out. Like, what am I doing if I'm criticizing world leaders and talking about international politics if this could happen to me?
Political violence is effective because it's used to silence either opposition or journalists. And so for me, writing this book, and I tried to dramatize it like a novel, it's quick. It's like only 210 pages, and then it's like 100 pages of notes. So I cited every sight, smell, or sound so that somebody that knows Thompson really well can be like, where the fuck did you get this information?
Right.
And somebody else can, if they have questions, just go back and look. But long story short, for me, the crux of the book was in Chicago in 1968, where Hunter Thompson had a press pass. He went to the Democratic National Convention. On Wednesday night, Mayor Daley gave this order to clear the intersection at Balboa in Michigan because there was a protest going on, 10,000 people. Thompson was standing next to the Haymarket Inn, which was on the ground floor level. It was a plate glass window. He was standing with delegates from the Democratic National Convention, standing with their wives, and the cops charged. They did like a double pincher formation, like Hannibal and like Kumai in like fucking 100 BC, and they split the protesters in half, beat everybody, hit Thompson over the head. He got his motorcycle helmet on just in time. So he's not concussed. He can see everything that's going on. And the entire plate glass window behind him shatters. Everybody falls in. Cops jump in, are beating everybody. And he's looking around, and he's sure that snipers on the roof are going to open fire at any moment. So he runs to the Blackstone where he's staying across the way, shows his room key, gets beat up by the cops as he's trying to get in. He goes, I live here, goddammit. I'm paying $100 a day. Let me in my fucking room. And he barely gets in. And he just sits on his bed afterwards, and he says, they knew I was press. They saw my press pass. They hit me because I was press. And if that's where we're at right now with journalists, if political opponents and journalists are being clubbed to keep silent and to not respond, then this is not the democracy we know.
Yeah, his ex-wife talked about that as being like one of the only moments where she saw him cry.
for 2 weeks.
He
He just cried
about-
afterwards for 2 weeks.
yeah.
He couldn't stop. It's crazy.
There was a crazy time, right? I mean, that time is very similar in a lot of ways to what's going on today. It's just today there's just so much more information and so much more. So people have so much more of an ability to communicate.
Yeah, and I think it's almost easier to coordinate violence. I was just talking to the head of the Proud Boys, Gavin McInnes's group, Enrique Tarrio, and he's like, he's saying, he's using the language of the left. He's like, I'm a victim. I can't buy groceries. They've taken my bank accounts, my platforms. But when he talks about violence, he's like, who the fuck are you, Antifa? Like, you're 120 pounds and wet. Like, if we have civil war, you're going to lose. And I was sitting next to him during the podcast. And basically what I said was, if we have a civil war, you're going to be hit by sniper fire from the fucking roof. You're not going to be in a fist fight with Antifa across the way. And I think there's this idea on the right that we can push towards violence and we can get very close to it with our rhetoric or with our actions, but that it won't spread, like the conflagration won't keep going.
Yeah, I don't know if that's isolated to the right.
I mean, with Antifa on the left too. And that's why I love Thompson was as hard on the left as he was on the right when he wrote. And that was so important for his intelligence as a writer.
But I think just even the left and the right in general for a lot of these people is just an identity and a gang that they belong to. And I don't think they really understand violence. You want to talk about violence, talk to a military guy.
Yeah.
Talk to someone who really understands what violence actually is. And they don't have this empty rhetoric like these fools do.
Exactly.
There's a lot of these people that are calling for violence. Like, no, you should be calling for camaraderie. Yep. You should be calling for communication. We should be calling for some way we could all work this out, where the civilians, the civilization that we live in, that we all can get along together, and most people don't want to impede you from living your life and doing what you want to do. Most people, vast majority.
Hunter Thompson believed in working within the system. He believed like it might be a fucked up system, but you can still run for sheriff in Aspen. And he believed once you resort to violence, that means the conversation is stopped.
Yeah.
And it disfigures you. So he cried for 2 weeks. That was the most surprising thing for me researching this book and writing it, was to see how much the violence affected him that he experienced at Chicago. And you can speak to someone who's done MMA fighting, who's been punched in the face as hard as somebody can punch you. Most Americans haven't had that. And that changes your ability to articulate something back in that moment. It means if that's political, if it's a police officer or a political opponent that uses violence instead of an argument to respond to you, we've left the realm that we recognize, and we're not going to be able to communicate even in the limited way that we're communicating right now. And Thompson knew that. So that's why after Chicago, I love that he went back to Aspen. And he's like, I'm going to run for fucking sheriff.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a mayoral campaign in Aspen. And that was brilliant because it was his way to control his environment, knowing that Mayor Daley's not listening to his nonviolent protest. Richard Nixon is not listening to his nonviolent protest. Thompson needed to find another avenue to try to work within the American system to make things happen. And a great contrast is his good friend, Oscar Zeta Acosta. There's a wonderful PBS documentary, Rise and Fall of the Brown Buffalo, by Philip Rodriguez, a great director, and it's Acosta's life. That's who Dr. Gonzo is based on. In Fear and Loathing. And Thompson had more advantages than Acosta, and Acosta was being pursued by the LAPD, was eventually set up by them. And for him, working within the system, he ran for sheriff, wasn't an option. The cops set him up for a high-speed bust. The cops had undercover agents from something called the Special Operations for Conspiracy, which was a fucking department in the LAPD at the time. And they were trying to use those provocateurs to incite violence against the plainclothes police, or the normal clothes police, so that lethal violence could be used to silence a civil rights movement in the Brown Berets.
So they used agent provocateurs to make it look like they were part of the protest?
Yeah,
that is an age-old tactic.
Right? That's how you destroy a civil rights movement, because the most effective weapon in silencing civil rights is lethal force. And you can do that in another country, as the U.S. has done, but the U.S. can't use tactics like My Lai, like Thompson writes about this, in the U.S., unless you have a provocative reason, unless somebody that's undercover attacks a cop. And so the cops then, like what happened on August 29th, 1970, during the moratorium riots, can just flood East LA and kill whoever they want. They blew Ruben Salazar's head off with a tear gas gun.